The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the small kitchen in Madison, Wisconsin. Outside, autumn leaves scattered across the suburban street. Inside, an old man's hands worked dough with practiced precision. Friedrich Schneider, Fritz to everyone who knew him, was 65 years old that October afternoon in 1985. His hands, weathered and scarred, moved with the certainty of a man who had built a life from flour and butter and the American dream. But today, those hands trembled. His grandson Elias sat at the kitchen table, 16 years old and full of the kind of certainty that comes before life teaches you otherwise. An envelope lay between them. Official, government seal, army recruitment materials. "Grandpa, you never talk about the war." Fritz didn't look up from the dough. Outside, a car passed. A dog barked. Normal sounds from a normal street in a normal American town. He had worked 40 years to earn normal. Because some things change how you see the world, Elias. The boy shifted in his chair. "I want to understand. I want to serve. The recruiter said I'd make a good paratrooper, like the guys who jumped on D-Day." Fritz's hands stopped. The dough sat there, half-formed, waiting. He looked at his grandson, Anna's eyes in a young face, full of life that hadn't yet learned what life could take away. "Then you need to understand something." He wiped flour from his hands, walked to the window. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass, and for a moment, Fritz wasn't in Wisconsin anymore. "What do you know about fear, Elias?" "I'm not afraid, Grandpa." "I know. That's what scares me." Fritz turned from the window. When he spoke again, his voice carried an accent that 40 years in America had smoothed, but never quite erased. "Let me tell you about the summer I learned what fear really meant." France, June 6, 1944. 2:47 in the morning. The world ended in noise. Friedrich Schneider was 24 years old, and he had been asleep in a farmhouse cellar 3 kilometers from the Normandy coast when the sky began to tear itself apart. Not the sharp crack of artillery, not the whistle of incoming shells. This was different, deeper, like the earth itself was growling. He grabbed his rifle before he was fully awake. Training. You slept with your boots on. You slept with your weapon close. You slept light because sleep could kill you. "Aircraft!" Klaus was already at the cellar stairs, silhouetted against the darkness above. "Hundreds of them!" They climbed into chaos. The night sky pulsed with searchlights. Tracer fire arced upward in long, lazy curves that looked beautiful until you remembered each streak was designed to tear through metal and flesh. The sound, God, the sound, was like standing inside a cathedral bell while someone struck it with a hammer, again and again and again. Fritz had been in France for 8 months. He had trained for 2 years before that. He thought he understood war. He understood nothing. "This is it." Helmut, their squad leader, was gathering the men. 32 years old, veteran of the Eastern Front, the kind of soldier who had seen enough to know when everything was about to go wrong. "The invasion! Get to your positions!" Fritz ran with the others through the darkness. Around them, the 716th Infantry Division was coming alive, like a kicked anthill. Men stumbling from billets, officers shouting orders, the staccato bark of machine gun fire from the coastal positions. But Fritz kept looking up. The aircraft. So many aircraft. "Paratroopers!" someone screamed. Fritz saw them then, dark shapes against darker sky, blossoming silk, catching searchlight beams for just a moment before vanishing into the fields beyond the village. Dozens, hundreds, like seeds scattered by a careless god. His first thought, and he would never forget this, was, "They're so vulnerable up there." His second thought came when he reached his defensive position and saw how widely scattered the drops were. They have no idea where they are. "Hold this crossroad!" Helmut positioned them quickly. 8 men. Good men. Klaus beside Fritz, his best friend since training, always joking, always finding something to laugh about, even when there was nothing funny left in the world. They'll be disorganized, confused. Pick your targets, conserve ammunition. The night settled into an uneasy quiet. The aircraft sounds faded, the searchlights swept empty sky. And somewhere out in those fields, men who had jumped from those planes were landing, gathering themselves, trying to figure out where the hell they were. Fritz checked his rifle for the fourth time. Beside him, Klaus lit a cigarette, cupping the flame. "American paratroopers," Klaus said quietly. "Poor bastards. Dropped in the dark. Scattered all over. They don't stand a chance." "Don't underestimate them," Helmut said from his position. "They volunteered for this. That makes them either very brave or very stupid." "Or both," Klaus grinned. Fritz said nothing. He was thinking about the photo in his breast pocket. Anna, 22 years old, dark hair, smile that made you believe in things bigger than war. A nurse in Hamburg, working while Fritz was here, doing this. He had promised her he would come home. That was before he understood what promises meant in war. The Americans came at dawn, 5 of them, moving down the road with their weapons up, spacing good, tactical sense clear. Fritz watched them through the pre-dawn grey. They wore different uniforms than he expected, camouflage patterns, equipment that looked well-made, expensive, rich nation's army. "Wait for my signal," Helmut whispered. The Americans were talking. Fritz could hear them even at 30 meters. Low voices, but voices nonetheless. One was pointing at a map. Another was scanning the hedgerows, but not carefully enough. They didn't see the ambush until it was too late. Helmut's shot dropped the point man. The others scattered, returning fire immediately. Professional, well-trained, but surprised. Fritz fired, missed, fired again. The American he was aiming at dove behind a low wall and started shooting back. Good position. The American was smart enough to find cover, smart enough to return accurate fire. For 3 minutes, it was chaos. Grenades, rifle fire, someone screaming in English. Klaus hit one of them. Fritz saw him fall. The Americans pulled back, dragging their wounded, laying down covering fire that forced Fritz to keep his head down. Then, engines. A German armored car coming up the road, machine gun hammering. The Americans broke contact. Professional withdrawal, covering each other. No panic. They disappeared into the hedgerows and were gone. Silence rushed back in. "Everybody good?" Helmut called. Fritz checked himself. Not hit. Klaus was reloading, grinning that grin. The others were fine except for Werner, who had caught a fragment in his shoulder. Not serious. But one of the Americans hadn't made it out. Private Garrett Sullivan, 23 years old, from Fort Worth, Texas, lay behind the wall with a sucking chest wound and terror in his eyes. Fritz reached him first. "Don't shoot!" The American's voice was tight with pain. "I surrender! I surrender!" "Medic!" Fritz called back to his squad. Then, in careful English, learned from school years that felt like another lifetime. "You are prisoner. I will help you." Garrett looked at him, really looked at him. 2 young men in different uniforms, one bleeding, one holding a rifle, and somewhere in that moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with armies or nations. "You speak English," Garrett said. "A little." Fritz was already opening the American's jacket, checking the wound. "Hold still." Klaus arrived with the medical kit. Together, they packed the wound, stopped the bleeding. The American would live. Probably. "You got family back home?" Fritz didn't know why he asked. "Ranch, Fort Worth." Garrett's voice was getting weaker. "My daddy's ranch. Was gonna take it over after..." He didn't finish. Fritz found a photo in the American's pocket that had fallen out. Garrett and an older couple, standing in front of a barn. Wide Texas sky, smiling. "They're waiting for you," Fritz said quietly, "so you stay alive." Garrett's eyes found Fritz's. "Why are you helping me? We were just trying to kill each other." "Because we are all just trying to go home." The German medics took Garrett away. Fritz kept the photo. Garrett had dropped it, and something made Fritz want to keep it. A reminder, maybe, that the men he was fighting had families too, had ranches in Texas, had fathers waiting for them to come home and take over. Klaus lit another cigarette. "You're too soft, Fritz." "Maybe." "The Americans," Helmut said, checking his weapon, "are brave. Very brave. I'll give them that." "But loud," Klaus added. "You could hear them coming from a kilometer away." Fritz nodded. It was true. The Americans fought well, but they fought the way rich armies fight, with noise, with coordination, with the certainty that support was coming, that reinforcements existed, that they were never truly alone. Helmut was cleaning his rifle, but his eyes were distant. "Be grateful," he said quietly, "that you didn't meet the British ones." "British?" Fritz asked. "I fought them in North Africa. Different animal entirely." Helmut's voice carried a weight Fritz didn't understand yet. "The Americans announced themselves. The British—" He paused. "The British are something else." Fritz didn't understand. Not yet. June 7th, 1944. Late afternoon. Patrol duty. 6 of them sweeping through abandoned farmland east of the village, looking for paratroopers who had scattered during the night drop. The Americans they had learned to listen for. You could hear them moving, talking, coordinating. This patrol was different. The farmhouse sat alone in a field, stone walls, collapsed roof, nothing special. Standard procedure: clear it. Make sure no enemy troops were using it as an observation post. Fritz approached from the south, Klaus from the west, Helmut leading, cautious, weapon ready. The others spread out in a textbook pattern. The house felt empty, no movement, no sound, windows like dead eyes. "I don't like this," Klaus whispered. "It's fine," Werner said. "Nothing here." They were 3 meters from the door when the world turned inside out. The first shot took Helmut in the throat. He made a sound like a cough and went down, blood fountaining. The second shot hit Werner in the chest. The third, fourth, fifth came so fast, Fritz couldn't track them, couldn't see where they originated, couldn't process what was happening. Klaus grabbed Fritz and pulled him behind a low wall. Return fire. Fritz was shooting at shadows, at nothing, at windows that showed no muzzle flash, no movement. "Where are they?" Klaus screamed. 3 British paratroopers materialized from positions Fritz would have sworn were empty. Not running, not panicking, methodical. 1 covering while 2 moved, then the opposite. Leapfrogging backward with a discipline that looked like choreography. Fritz fired, missed, fired again. One of the British stumbled but didn't fall. Then they were gone. Vanished into the hedgerows like smoke. The whole thing had taken maybe 20 seconds. Klaus was shaking. What the hell was that? Fritz couldn't answer. He was staring at where Helmut lay. 32 years old, veteran, survivor of the Eastern Front. Dead in a field in France because he hadn't seen 3 men who were right there in front of him. Werner was still breathing. Barely. They got him back to the aid station, but he died before midnight. 2 men dead. Fritz hadn't even seen the British paratroopers until they were already shooting. Hadn't heard them move, hadn't detected any sign they were there. That night, Fritz wrote to Anna. He didn't tell her about Helmut or Werner. He told her he was fine. He told her he loved her. He told her to take care of herself. He didn't tell her that he had learned a new kind of fear today. The Americans you could hear coming. You could prepare. You could fight them on equal terms, soldier to soldier, training against training. The British were something else entirely. Ghosts. 2 British and American paratroopers were scattered, but not broken. They had regrouped. They were fighting with a determination that impressed even the German commanders, who had expected the airborne assault to collapse within hours. But Fritz was learning to tell the difference. When Americans attacked, you heard them. The roar of coordinated fire, the shouts of squad leaders, the methodical advance that said, "We have support, we have backup, we are not alone." Good tactics, effective tactics, but readable. When the British attacked, you didn't hear them until it was too late. Fritz kept a notebook, small, waterproof. He recorded his observations like a scientist documenting a disease. June 9th, American patrol encountered. Heavy firefight, both sides withdrew, casualties even. June 11th, British ambush, never saw them, lost 3 men, no enemy casualties confirmed. June 14th, American assault on checkpoint, repelled, they withdrew under covering fire. Professional. June 15th, British night raid on command post, 2 kilometers behind our lines. How did they get there? The pattern became clear. When Fritz's unit fought Americans, they won about 60% of engagements. Tactical victories, reasonable casualties. the kind of warfare he had trained for. When they fought the British, they never really won. Even when they drove them off, even when they held their ground, Fritz's unit took casualties out of proportion to the size of the British forces. Snipers that materialized from nowhere, ambushes in places they had swept an hour before. A feeling, constant, grinding, that they were being watched. "It's their training," Klaus said one night, huddled in a foxhole while rain turned the French earth to mud. "Has to be. They train harder, fight dirtier." No, Fritz was thinking of Helmut, of Werner, of the 4 other men from his original squad who were gone now. It's something else. It's like they don't think like soldiers.
What do you mean? Soldiers follow doctrine, tactics. There are rules. Even the Americans, as good as they are, they follow the rules. The British, he struggled to articulate it. The British fight like the rules don't apply to them. Klaus lit a cigarette in cupped hands. "You're overthinking it." Maybe, but Fritz didn't think so. He had seen American paratroopers captured. They were defiant but realistic. They knew they had done their job. They knew reinforcements would come. They surrendered when the situation was tactically hopeless, because that's what soldiers did. The British didn't surrender, or rarely did. Fritz had heard stories from other units. British paratroopers fighting from burning buildings, British squads holding positions against overwhelming odds for no reason that made tactical sense, as if retreat simply wasn't in their vocabulary. The replacements arrived to fill out the depleted squad. Young boys mostly, 17, 18 years old, fresh from training, terrified. Fritz found himself in Helmut's role now, acting squad leader, teaching them what he had learned. "Listen to me," he told them on a quiet evening when the front was somewhere else. "If you hear Americans, be ready. They're brave, they're well-trained, but you can fight them." The boys nodded, writing notes, trying to look confident. "If you don't hear anything," Fritz continued, "if the world gets quiet and the birds stop singing and the air feels wrong, that's when you need to be afraid. That's the British." "How do we fight them?" one of the boys asked. Fritz thought about Helmut, about Werner, about the 3 shadows that had appeared and disappeared like they had never been real at all. "Carefully," he said. "Very carefully." June 23rd, 1944. The order came at dawn. Fritz's company, or what was left of it, was being moved to support a counterattack. Priority target, a bridge over the Orne River, code name Pegasus. British paratroopers had seized it on D-Day. They were still holding it, 3 weeks later. Only 150 of them, the company commander briefed them. His voice carried the kind of forced confidence that meant he didn't believe his own words. "We are 400. Artillery support, armor support. This should be straightforward." Fritz looked at Klaus. Klaus looked back. Neither said anything. They both knew better now. The approach to Pegasus Bridge was across open ground, flat, exposed. Every military manual said you didn't assault across open ground against dug-in defenders. But orders were orders. At 0800 hours, the attack began. The British let them get close. 200 meters, 150. Fritz was running, head down, waiting for the shooting to start. It started, methodical. Not the spray and pray of panicked defenders, aimed shots. A machine gun opened up, firing short bursts that said, "We have ammunition discipline, we know what we're doing, we can do this all day." Men fell around Fritz. He dove behind a wrecked vehicle. Klaus landed beside him, breathing hard. "This is insane!" Klaus shouted over the gunfire. "We have to take that bridge!" "We're going to die trying." They weren't wrong. The first assault lasted 2 hours. Then they pulled back, regrouped, counted casualties. 40 men down. The bridge was still in British hands. The second assault was worse. This time the British had adjusted. They knew the approach routes. They knew where the Germans would take cover. They knew everything. Fritz saw a sniper, just once. A flash of movement in a building on the far side of the bridge. Private Danny Carter, though Fritz would never learn his name. 21 years old. Crack shot. Carter killed 12 Germans that afternoon. Fritz watched 3 of them die. Headshots, center mass,
professional.
Klaus was beside Fritz when the third assault fell apart. They were pinned behind a stone wall, artillery falling somewhere to their left, smoke everywhere, chaos everywhere. "We need to fall back," Fritz called to the squad leader. But the order was to take the bridge. Klaus raised his head to look for a better firing position, just for a second. The British sniper didn't need more than that. The bullet hit Klaus in the temple. He dropped without a sound. Fritz caught him. His best friend. The one who always joked. The one who made you forget. The one who was supposed to survive this. Klaus's eyes were open but seeing nothing. Blood on Fritz's hands. Blood on the French earth. Blood everywhere. Something broke in Fritz then. Not his courage, not his discipline. Something deeper. He understood now. These men, these British paratroopers, they weren't defending a strategically vital position. The war wasn't going to be won or lost at this one bridge.
But they were holding it anyway. Because someone had told them to hold it. And they would hold it until every last one of them was dead. That wasn't tactics. That wasn't training. That was something else. Something that made them terrifying in a way Fritz couldn't articulate. They didn't fight to win. They fought because retreat wasn't an option they allowed themselves to consider. The third assault failed. The company pulled back. Fritz carried Klaus's body. Someone else would write to Klaus's parents, would tell them their son had died bravely, would not mention that he had died trying to take a bridge that had already cost 150 German lives. That night, Fritz sat alone and cried. Not from fear, not from despair, from understanding. He understood now why Helmut had said, "Be grateful you didn't meet the British ones." He understood now what the Americans were, and what the British were, and why one made you cautious while the other made you afraid.
The Americans were warriors, brave, honorable, dangerous. The British were something that didn't have a name, ghosts who took your friends and never gave them back, soldiers who followed orders past the point where following orders made any sense at all. Fritz wrote to Anna that night. He told her about Klaus. He told her he was tired. He told her he loved her and missed her and wanted nothing more than to come home to Hamburg and never think about bridges or battlefields or the sound of rifle fire ever again. He didn't tell her that he had stopped believing he would survive this war. July 1944. The Normandy fighting continued. The Americans and British pushed inland. The German defense crumbled bit by bit. Fritz's unit retreated, regrouped, retreated again. The war was clearly lost. Everyone knew it. No one said it. In late July, transfer orders came. Fritz's surviving squad, 6 men out of the original 8, was being sent south, to Italy, away from the British paratroopers, away from the ghosts. Fritz felt relief so profound, it was almost shameful. August 1944, northern Italy. The Italian mountains were beautiful in a way that made the war seem like a temporary madness. Snow on distant peaks, valleys green with summer growth. For the first week, Fritz's new unit saw little combat. Anna was here, working with a hospital unit that had evacuated south ahead of the Allied advance. The coincidence felt like providence. Fritz got 3 days' leave, a small miracle in the middle of war. They met in a small town whose name Fritz would later struggle to remember. What he remembered was Anna's face, the way she ran to him, the way she felt in his arms after 8 months apart. "I thought you were dead," she whispered into his chest. "I thought I was too." They walked through the town, holding hands like teenagers, pretending for a few hours that the war didn't exist. They talked about Hamburg, about the future, about the bakery Fritz dreamed of opening when this was over. "Will we survive this?" Anna asked. Fritz didn't know how to answer. He had watched Klaus die, had seen Helmut and Werner and so many others, had learned that promises meant nothing when British paratroopers decided to hold a bridge. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I want to try." On the second day of his leave, Fritz made a decision. They married in a small church with no family present, no celebration, no honeymoon, just a priest and 2 people who loved each other and wanted to make something official before the world took that chance away forever. Anna wore a dress borrowed from another nurse. Fritz wore his uniform because he owned nothing else. The ceremony took 10 minutes. It was the happiest 10 minutes of Fritz's life. "Promise me you'll survive this," Anna said afterward. Fritz held her. "I promise." He had made that promise before. He understood now how empty promises were in war. But he made it anyway because Anna needed to hear it, and he needed to say it. On the third day, Fritz had to report back to his unit. Anna walked him to the transport. They held each other without speaking. Words felt inadequate. "I love you," Anna finally said. "I love you too, always." Fritz climbed into the truck, watched Anna disappear behind him. His wife. 3 days of marriage, and now months or years of separation. But he had something now, something more than just survival. He had a reason. Anna, a future, a life to build when this madness ended. Anna stayed in his thoughts like a talisman, something pure, something worth surviving for. September 1944, Northern Holland. The orders came without warning. Transfer, North, Holland. Immediate deployment. Fritz packed his gear and tried not to think about what waited for him there. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew. The war was ending. The Allies were winning. And somewhere in Holland, another major operation was being planned. He had survived France. He had survived Italy. He had found Anna and married her. Now he had to survive whatever hell awaited him in the north. Because he had promised Anna. And promises, however fragile, were all that kept men like Fritz fighting when everything else said to give up. He boarded the transport north and watched Italy disappear behind him. Ahead, the sky was dark with clouds. And somewhere in that darkness, the ghosts were waiting. Madison, Wisconsin, October 1985. The kitchen had grown dark while Fritz talked. Elias hadn't moved from his chair. The recruitment envelope lay forgotten on the table between them.
"Grandpa," Elias said quietly, "you married Grandma before Arnhem?" Fritz smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that carries 40 years of memory. "August 1944. In a church in northern Italy. She wore a dress borrowed from another nurse. I wore my uniform because I owned nothing else. We had 3 days together before I was sent north. To Holland. To hell." Fritz's voice dropped. "But I didn't know that yet." He stood, walked to the window again. Outside, the streetlights were coming on. Normal American evening. Normal American street. "What I'm about to tell you, Elias, this is why I never talked about the war. Because some memories, they don't fit into words. But you need to hear this. Before you sign those papers and jump out of airplanes, you need to understand what war really costs." Elias leaned forward. "I'm listening." "Then listen carefully. Because in September 1944, I learned the difference between surviving and living, and I learned it from men who refused to do either." September 12, 1944, Northern Holland. The town of Oosterbeek sat quiet in the afternoon sun, pleasant, almost peaceful. Fritz's regiment had been there for a week, refitting after the retreat from France. The 9th SS Panzer Division was camped nearby, their tanks parked in orchards, their men resting. Everyone knew the war was lost. No one said it out loud, but you could see it in the way officers stopped talking when enlisted men walked past. You could hear it in Radio Berlin's increasingly desperate pronouncements of wonder weapons and turning tides. Fritz didn't care about the war anymore. He cared about surviving long enough to see Anna again. She was still in Italy. Her letters arrived irregularly, delayed by the chaos of retreat and reassignment. The last one sat in his breast pocket, read so many times the creases were wearing through. "My dearest Fritz, I think of you every moment. The hospital is overwhelmed. So many wounded. So many boys who will never go home. Please, please be careful. I cannot lose you. We have a life to build when this madness ends. Your wife, Anna." Your wife. Those words gave Fritz strength when nothing else could. A life to build. That's what Fritz held on to. Not victory, not duty, just the simple promise of a future that involved Anna and peace,
and never thinking about British paratroopers again. "Schneider!" Fritz looked up from the letter. His new squad leader, Corporal Richter, late 20s, practical, not cruel, was approaching with a map. "Intelligence briefing in 10 minutes. Something's happening. Something's always happening. Not like this. Allied aircraft everywhere. Reconnaissance flights. Transport planes. It looks like—" He didn't need to finish. Fritz knew what it looked like. The briefing room was crowded with officers and senior NCOs. Fritz stood in the back, listening to a major from intelligence drone through the assessment.
"We've detected significant Allied air activity over the past 48 hours. Analysis suggests a major airborne operation is imminent. Target is likely the Rhine bridges, Arnhem, Nijmegen, possibly Eindhoven." A colonel from the 9th SS spoke up. "What forces are we facing?" "Preliminary intelligence suggests American 82nd and 101st Airborne, and—" the major paused, "British 1st Airborne Division." The room went quiet. Fritz felt something cold settle in his stomach. Men who had fought in Normandy, who had seen what British paratroopers could do, exchanged glances. "How many?" someone asked. "Potentially 10,000 British, maybe more." 10,000. Fritz thought about Pegasus Bridge, about 150 British paratroopers holding against overwhelming odds, about Klaus dying in a field because those 150 refused to give up a bridge that shouldn't have mattered. Now 10,000 of them were coming.
"Our orders," the colonel said, standing, "are to hold the Arnhem Bridge at all costs. The bridge must not fall into Allied hands. Is that understood?" Everyone nodded. Fritz wondered if any of them believed they could actually do it. He thought of Anna. 3 days of marriage, a lifetime of promises. He had to survive this. September 17th, 1944, 1 p.m. The sky filled with aircraft, not hundreds, thousands. Transport planes in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon, fighter escorts weaving above them, the sound so overwhelming it stopped being sound and became something physical, pressing down on the earth. Fritz watched from his position near the Arnhem Bridge. Around him, his squad stood in stunned silence. "Mein Gott," Richter whispered. The paratroopers began falling, silk canopies blossoming against the blue September sky like flowers, like snow, like something beautiful that was bringing death. They fell in the fields west of Arnhem. They fell near Oosterbeek. They fell in neat patterns that spoke of planning and precision and the kind of confidence that came from knowing you had the resources of empires behind you. "Positions!" officers were shouting. "Get to your fighting positions!" Fritz ran with the others. The bridge was the key terrain. Whoever controlled the bridge controlled the Rhine crossing. Whoever controlled the Rhine crossing controlled the route into Germany. The British would come for this bridge. Fritz knew it with the certainty of a man who had watched them fight for bridges before. The first contact came at 4 p.m. British paratroopers moving through the town in small teams, probing, testing, finding the weak points. Fritz's position, a reinforced building overlooking the bridge's northern approach, suddenly erupted with gunfire. "Contact north! Multiple targets!" Fritz fired. Missed. A British soldier, maybe 30 years old, red beret, moving with the kind of tactical awareness that said veteran, ducked behind cover and returned fire. Accurate. Professional. The firefight lasted 10 minutes. Then the British pulled back. Not retreating, probing, learning. "They're going to attack the bridge tonight," Fritz said to Richter. "How do you know?" "Because that's what they do. They don't wait. They don't hesitate. They hit hard and fast before we can reinforce. We already have 2 companies defending the bridge. It won't be enough." Richter looked at Fritz, really looked at him. "You sound like you're afraid of them." Fritz thought about Klaus, about Helmut, about all the men he had watched die because they hadn't been afraid enough. "I am afraid of them. And if you're smart, you will be too." He thought of Anna, her smile, her voice, the way she felt in his arms. He had to survive this for her. September 17th, 1944, 8 p.m. The British came in darkness. Not screaming, not charging, moving like water, flowing through streets, using shadows, appearing where they shouldn't be able to appear. Lieutenant Edmund Parrish led the assault on the northern end of Arnhem Bridge. Fritz would learn his name later from documents captured from intelligence reports. But that night, Parrish was just a shadow commanding other shadows. The British hit Fritz's position with grenades and concentrated fire. Room clearing, building to building, methodical. Fritz and 4 others held the second floor of a brick building. Below them, British paratroopers were fighting through the ground level. Above them, the roof was burning from an incendiary grenade. "We need to fall back," one of the younger soldiers screamed. "Fall back where?" Fritz fired down the stairwell. A British soldier dropped, but 2 more took his place. "They're between us and the bridge." The building shook. Something exploded. The ceiling cracked. Smoke everywhere. Fritz made a decision. Window. Now. We jumped to the next building. "That's 3 meters. Better than burning." They jumped. Fritz landed hard, rolled, came up with his rifle ready. The others made it. Barely. Behind them, the building they had abandoned was fully engulfed. British paratroopers were already moving past it, securing their foothold. By midnight, the British held the northern end of the bridge. Fritz's company had been pushed back into the town. Casualties were catastrophic. Of the 200 men who had started the day defending the bridge approaches, maybe 60 were still combat effective. And the British had maybe 100 men holding that end of the bridge. 100 men against an entire SS Panzer division. It should have been a slaughter. It became a siege. September 18th, 1944, Day 2. The counterattack began at dawn. Tanks, half-tracks, infantry support. Everything the Germans could throw at 100 British paratroopers dug into buildings around the bridge's northern ramp. Fritz watched from a defensive position 2 blocks away. He wasn't part of the assault. His squad's job was to prevent British reinforcements from reaching the bridge. The assault looked impressive, coordinated, overwhelming. It failed. The British had turned every building into a fortress. They had machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. They had snipers who killed tank commanders before the tanks could maneuver. They had Panzerfaust weapons captured from German supply dumps, used against German armor with devastating accuracy. The first attack fell apart in 30 minutes. The second attack, 2 hours later, lasted longer but achieved nothing. Fritz watched SS infantry, some of the best soldiers Germany had, get chewed apart trying to dislodge British paratroopers from a cluster of brick buildings. "They're going to run out of ammunition," Richter said beside him. "Maybe." Fritz wasn't so sure. "Or maybe they'll fight with rocks when the bullets are gone." "That's insane." "Yes, that's what makes them terrifying." By evening, the Germans had made no progress. The British still held the bridge. Casualties on both sides were mounting, but the ratio was wrong. The Germans should have been killing 10 British for every German lost. Instead, it was closer to 2 to 1. The mathematics of warfare were breaking down. That night, Fritz wrote to Anna. He didn't know if the letter would ever reach her, but he wrote anyway. "My love, I am in Holland, fighting for a bridge that means nothing to me. All around, men are dying for objectives that won't matter in a month. The British are here. You remember I told you about them? They are everything I feared and worse. But I am being careful. I am surviving. I will come home to you. I promise. Your husband, Fritz." He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, knew that promises meant nothing in places like this, but he made them anyway, for Anna, for himself, for the life they would build when this madness ended. September 19th, 1944, Day 3. The fighting intensified. German forces were building up around Arnhem. More tanks, more artillery, more men. The British perimeter was shrinking. Intelligence estimated they had maybe 200 men left combat effective around the bridge. 200 against thousands. They should have surrendered. They didn't. Fritz's squad was moved forward into the assault, building-to-building clearance, urban combat at its worst. Every room could hold death. Every doorway could be a kill zone. They hit a 3-story building that British paratroopers had fortified. The assault went in hard. Grenades, automatic fire, the kind of violence that was supposed to overwhelm defenders. The British fought from the cellars up. When the ground floor fell, they fell back to the second floor. When the second floor became untenable, they fell back to the third. Fritz and his squad fought their way to the second floor. Bodies everywhere, British and German, the smell of blood and cordite and burning wood. A British paratrooper, wounded, propped against a wall, fired at Fritz. Missed. The soldier's rifle clicked empty. Fritz raised his weapon. The British soldier didn't raise his hands, didn't surrender, just stared at Fritz with eyes that said, "Do it or don't, but I'm not begging." "Why?" Fritz asked in English. "Why do you keep fighting? You're surrounded. You're outnumbered. You cannot win." The British soldier, Corporal Alistair Byrne, 26 years old, from London, though Fritz wouldn't learn that until later, coughed, blood on his lips. "We were told to hold the bridge, so we hold the bridge." "That's insane." "Maybe, but it's what we do." Fritz lowered his rifle, couldn't shoot. This soldier, enemy or not, reminded him too much of Klaus, of Helmut, of all the men who followed orders because orders were all they had left to believe in. And he thought of Anna, of the promise he had made to her, to survive with honor, to be someone she could be proud of. "You're wounded, I have medical supplies." Alistair looked at Fritz like he was speaking a foreign language. "Why would you help me?" "Because a long time ago, a man named Garrett Sullivan taught me something. We're all just trying to go home." Fritz bandaged Alistair's wounds. Shrapnel in the side, painful but not fatal if treated. Around them, the building burned. Fighting continued on the floor above. "I should take you prisoner," Fritz said. "I won't surrender." "I know. That's why I'm going to tell my men you were dead when we found you." "Why?" Fritz thought of Anna, of the life he wanted to build, of the difference between surviving and being able to live with yourself after surviving. "Because enough good men have died on this bridge, and because you remind me of my friend. He died at a different bridge, in France, fighting men like you, and because I have a wife waiting for me, and I want to be the kind of man she believes I am." Alistair's eyes found Fritz's. Understanding passed between them. Not friendship, not even respect, just recognition. One soldier seeing another, both trying to survive, both trying to hold on to their humanity in the middle of hell. "What's your name?" Alistair asked. "Friedrich. Fritz." "Alistair, if we both survive this, Fritz, buy me a drink." "Deal." Fritz left Alistair hidden in a cellar room, covered with debris, alive but out of the fight. He told his squad the area was clear. They moved on. Later, much later, Fritz would wonder if Alistair survived, if British medics found him, if he made it home to London. But that night, all Fritz knew was that he had saved one life in a war that was taking millions. It was a small thing, but it felt important. It felt like something Anna would want him to do. September 20th to 24th, 1944. Days 4 through 8. The battle became a nightmare of repetition. Attack, fail, regroup, attack again, fail again. The British perimeter shrank day by day, street by street, building by building, but it never broke. On day 4, Fritz witnessed something that would stay with him forever. A British sniper, isolated in a burned-out church tower, held off an entire German company for 6 hours. When they finally stormed the tower, they found him dead from blood loss, slumped over his rifle. He had fired every round he possessed. Beside him, a photo of a woman and 2 small children. Fritz took the photo, added it to Garrett's, to the growing collection of evidence that the men trying to kill him were human. On day 5, the pattern continued. German artillery pounded British positions. Buildings collapsed into rubble. Surely no one could survive that level of bombardment. British return fire kept coming. Fritz watched soldiers, British paratroopers, down to their last magazines, their last grenades, fighting from buildings that were actively collapsing around them, refused to give up. German officers grew frustrated, then angry, then something close to desperate. "They have no food," one captain screamed during a briefing. "No resupply, no reinforcements. Why won't they break?" Fritz knew why. Because breaking wasn't in their vocabulary. Because somewhere, some British commander had told them to hold, and they were going to hold
until every last one of them was dead or the order was rescinded. It wasn't rational, but war had stopped being rational somewhere around the time Fritz had watched Klaus die for a bridge that didn't matter. On day 6, Fritz's squad was part of an assault on a cluster of buildings near the bridge. The British inside were down to maybe 20 men. They had been cut off for 5 days. Intelligence said they were out of ammunition. Intelligence was wrong. The British fought with a ferocity that Fritz had learned to recognize, not the desperate fury of trapped animals, the cold, calculated violence of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. They used captured German weapons when their own ammunition ran out. They threw rocks when the grenades were gone. They fought with bayonets and rifle butts and bare hands when everything else failed. The assault failed. On day 7, Fritz found a diary in a destroyed building. It belonged to a British corporal named Thomas Wright, 23 years old, from Manchester. The last entry read, Day 7. No food, water running low, ammunition nearly gone. Half the lads are wounded, but we're still here, still holding. The Jerrys keep coming, and we keep sending them back. Don't know how much longer we can do this, but orders are orders. We hold until relieved or dead. Mum, if you're reading this, know that I did my duty. Tell Sarah I loved her. Fritz put the diary in his pack with the others. These men deserved to be remembered, deserved to have their stories told, even if they were the enemy, especially because they were the enemy. On day 8, Fritz stopped sleeping. The exhaustion was beyond physical. It was existential. The grinding realization that you were fighting an enemy that couldn't be beaten because they refused to acknowledge that beating was possible. He thought of Anna constantly, her face, her voice, the promises they had made. He had to survive. For her, for the life they would build. That was all that mattered now. September 25th, 1944, day 9. The British began evacuating, not surrendering, evacuating. Under cover of darkness, the survivors, maybe 300 out of the thousands who had dropped 9 days earlier, withdrew across the Rhine. Fritz watched from a position overlooking the river. British boats, British covering fire, British discipline even in retreat. When morning came and German forces swept the British positions, they found the true cost. Buildings fortified with furniture, rubble, anything they could use. Fighting positions that showed tactical genius in their placement. Ammunition expended down to the last round. Medical supplies exhausted. Food gone. And bodies. British paratroopers who had fought in those positions until they couldn't fight anymore. Fritz walked through a building where British soldiers had made their last stand, found personal effects, photos, letters. A diary belonging to Lieutenant Edmund Parrish. He opened it to the last entry. September 24th. We have held for 8 days. Ammunition nearly gone. No food since yesterday. Men exhausted beyond description. But the bridge still stands, and we still hold our ground. If this is the end, then at least we did our duty. Tell our families we did not run. We never run. Fritz closed the diary, put it in his pack. Didn't know why. Maybe to remember. Maybe to understand. Maybe to have proof that these men were real, were human, had families and hopes and fears just like him. The battle was over. The British had lost. They hadn't held the bridge. Market Garden had failed. The Rhine crossing wouldn't happen. But standing in those ruins, looking at what those men had endured, Fritz didn't feel like the Germans had won. They had survived, barely, against an enemy that by all rights should have been crushed on day 1. Richter found Fritz sitting on rubble, staring at nothing. You all right? I don't know. We held the bridge. We won. Fritz looked at his squad leader. Good man, practical, hadn't fought the British before Arnhem. Did we win, or did we just outlast them? What's the difference? Fritz thought about that, about Pegasus Bridge and Normandy and 9 days of hell at Arnhem, about British paratroopers who fought in burning buildings and held positions that should have been abandoned and refused to surrender, even when surrender was the only sane option. The difference, Fritz said slowly, is that I'm afraid of them. And I wasn't afraid when this started. They taught me to fear them. And that fear,
That's going to follow me for the rest of my life. They're just soldiers. No, they're not. They're something else. Something I don't have words for. Fritz stood. His squad was waiting. The war was still happening. There would be more fights, more days of survival. But Fritz knew something had changed inside him. He had fought Americans, brave men, honorable soldiers, dangerous opponents. But the British had shown him what it looked like when men decided that failure simply wasn't an option they would accept. When they transformed orders into articles of faith and held ground past the point where holding made any tactical sense. And that transformation, that absolute refusal to break, was more terrifying than any amount of firepower or numerical superiority, because you couldn't fight it with tactics. You could only endure it and hope that when it was over, you were still alive. And think of Anna, and survive for her, and try to be the man she believed you were. Fritz touched the letters in his breast pocket. Anna's, the promise of a future. He had survived Normandy. He had survived Pegasus Bridge. He had survived 9 days of Arnhem. Now, he just had to survive long enough to see his wife again. Madison, Wisconsin, October 1985. Fritz stopped talking. The kitchen was fully dark now. Elias sat in silence, the recruitment envelope forgotten. "Did Alistair survive?" Elias finally asked. Fritz smiled, reached into his pocket, pulled out an envelope, recent postmark, British stamps. "He wrote me last month. Lives in London, has grandchildren. We've been writing for 40 years. You've stayed in touch with the enemy." He stopped being the enemy when I bandaged his wounds. We were just 2 men trying to survive. And we did. Fritz put the letter down. "But there's more you need to hear, Elias. The war didn't end at Arnhem. And the lessons got harder." "What happened next?" "Winter. The war ending. And me learning that surviving wasn't the same as being able to live with yourself." Fritz stood, turned on a light. The sudden brightness made Elias blink. "Tomorrow night," Fritz said, "I'll tell you about the last 6 months of the war, about surrender and understanding and why I left Germany for America. But tonight, you need to think about something." "What?" "Those British paratroopers at Arnhem. They chose to fight past the point where fighting made sense. They chose duty over survival. And they were heroes for it." Fritz's voice grew quiet, but they were also broken by it. The ones who survived. You could see it in their eyes when they were evacuated. They had won a moral victory, but lost something inside themselves. What did they lose? The ability to believe that limits exist. That's what makes you dangerous, and that's what destroys you. Fritz picked up the recruitment envelope, handed it to Elias. "Think carefully before you sign this. Being a paratrooper means accepting that one day someone will tell you to hold a bridge or a position or a piece of worthless ground. And you'll have to decide, do I hold until it makes sense to withdraw? Or do I hold until I'm dead? What would you choose?" "I chose to survive. That's why I'm here to tell you this story. The British at Arnhem chose duty. That's why they're heroes." Fritz's eyes held his grandson's. "But both choices have costs. And you need to understand those costs before you jump out of your first airplane." Elias nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," Fritz said. "I'll finish the story tomorrow." He walked to the window, looked out at the peaceful American street, and wondered, not for the first time, what Alistair Byrne was doing on this same autumn evening across an ocean in London. Probably thinking about the same bridge, probably carrying the same scars, probably wondering, like Fritz, whether they had been heroes or just survivors, or if there was even a difference. October 1985, the second evening. Elias arrived at his grandfather's house just as the sun was setting. He had spent the entire day thinking about Arnhem, about bridges and British paratroopers, and the difference between surviving and living. Fritz was in the kitchen again, but this time he wasn't baking. He was looking at a wooden box on the table. Old, worn, the kind of thing you kept locked in a closet for 40 years. "You came back," Fritz said. "You said you'd finish the story." "I did." Fritz gestured to a chair. "Sit. This part is harder to tell, because this is where I learned that everything I thought I understood about fear was wrong. Elias sat. The box sat between them like a presence. What's in the box? Proof, Fritz said quietly. Proof that enemies can become friends, that fear can become respect, that the ghosts were just men after all. He didn't open the box yet. Outside, the autumn evening was turning cold. Inside, an old man gathered his memories and prepared to share the ones that still hurt. After Arnhem, Fritz began, I thought I understood the British. I thought I knew what made them terrifying. I was wrong. Because the real lesson, the one that changed everything, I didn't learn until the very end. November 1944, Western Germany. The war had come home. Fritz's unit, what remained of it after Arnhem, was pulled back to defensive positions along the Rhine. The great river that was supposed to protect Germany. The barrier that was supposed to keep the Allied armies at bay. Everyone knew it wouldn't hold. The Americans were coming from the south and west, the British from the northwest, the Russians from the east. Germany was being crushed from all sides, and the only question that mattered anymore was, would you survive long enough to see the end? Fritz had been promoted, battlefield promotion, sergeant now, not because he wanted it, because everyone above him was dead. He was 25 years old and felt 60. His new command was a collection of boys and old men. The real army was gone, dead in Russia, dead in France, dead in the desperate defense of a country that had started a war it couldn't win. Fritz's squad, 12 men. Youngest was 16, oldest was 52. None of them had the training, the experience, or the will to fight like soldiers were supposed to fight. So Fritz taught them to survive. Listen to me, he told them on a cold November morning, frost on the ground, their breath misting in the air. We're going to encounter Americans and British in the coming weeks. You need to understand the difference. The boys looked at him with eyes that wanted to believe he could keep them alive. Americans are dangerous. They have superior numbers, superior equipment, superior firepower. But they follow patterns. They coordinate. They rely on support. If you're smart, if you're careful, you can predict what they'll do. One of the boys raised his hand. And the British? Fritz paused. How to explain 4 years of accumulated fear? The British are different, especially their paratroopers, their commandos, their special units. They operate in small teams, they move silently, they strike when you least expect it, and they never, ever give up. How do we fight them? You don't. You avoid them. And if you can't avoid them, you be very, very careful. The 52-year-old, Gunther, a veteran of the First War, recalled to service because Germany was running out of men, spoke up. You sound afraid of them. I am afraid of them. And that fear has kept me alive for 4 years. Fear isn't weakness. Fear is respect. And respect keeps you cautious. Fritz drilled them on tactics. Not aggressive tactics, survival tactics. How to retreat without panicking. How to recognize when a position was lost. How to surrender if surrender became necessary. Some officers would have called this defeatism. Fritz called it reality. And he thought of Anna, waiting for him, believing in him. He would do whatever it took to see her again. December 1944, the Ardennes offensive, Germany's last throw of the dice. The counteroffensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, turn the tide of the war. Fritz's unit wasn't part of the main assault. They held a secondary position, watching for Allied counterattacks. The offensive began with optimism, German tanks rolling forward, Allied forces caught by surprise. For 3 days it looked like it might actually work. Then the weather cleared. Allied aircraft filled the skies, and the American response came with a fury that reminded Fritz why Germany had already lost this war. His position was hit by American artillery on the 4th day. Not British, not paratroopers, just regular American infantry with overwhelming fire support. Fritz pulled his squad back. No heroic last stands, no holding to the death, just a careful, controlled withdrawal that saved 11 out of 12 lives. The one they lost was the 16-year-old, Peter. He had frozen during the retreat, panicked, broken cover. American machine gun fire cut him down before Fritz could reach him.
Fritz held Peter while he died. The boy cried for his mother. They always did at the end. "I'm sorry," Peter whispered, blood bubbling at his lips. "I'm sorry, Sergeant." "You have nothing to be sorry for," Fritz said, but Peter was already gone. 16 years old. Should have been in school. Should have been chasing girls and worrying about exams. Not dying in a frozen Belgian forest because old men in Berlin had started a war they couldn't finish. That night, Fritz wrote to Anna. The letters were getting through irregularly now, postal service collapsing along with everything else, but he wrote anyway. "Anna, my love, I lost a boy today, 16 years old. He should have been in school, not a uniform. This war has taken everything from Germany, our soldiers, our cities, our future. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I am so tired. But I think of you, and I find strength for one more day. Your Fritz." He didn't know if she would ever read it. He didn't know if he would ever see her again. But hope, however thin, was all that kept him moving forward. January 1945. The Ardennes offensive failed. The German army retreated again. Always retreating now, always losing. Fritz's squad encountered British forces for the first time since Arnhem. Not paratroopers this time, regular infantry, but they carried themselves with the same quiet competence that Fritz had learned to recognize, the same discipline, the same sense that they knew exactly what they were doing and weren't particularly worried about the Germans' ability to stop them. The engagement was brief. Fritz's position was probed, tested, found to be defended. The British pulled back and called in artillery. Fritz pulled his squad out before the shells arrived. No casualties. Another day survived. But something had changed in Fritz's perception. Watching these British soldiers, tired men, cold men, men who just wanted to go home, Fritz realized something. The fear he carried wasn't fear of monsters. It was fear of facing someone better than you, someone who had mastered their craft while you were still learning. That realization didn't make them less dangerous, but it made them comprehensible. It made them human. "Sergeant," Gunther said as they withdrew, "those British soldiers, they looked as tired as we are." "They are," Fritz said. "They're just men, like us, just doing a job. But you said to fear them." "I do fear them, but not because they're monsters, because they're professionals, and professionals are far more dangerous than monsters." Fritz thought of Alistair Byrne, wounded, bleeding, but still refusing to surrender, still following orders even when orders made no sense. That wasn't inhuman. That was the most human thing of all. Holding on to duty when everything else was falling apart. March 1945. The Rhine crossings. The Allies crossed the Rhine in force. American, British, and Canadian armies pouring into Germany's heartland. The defensive line that was supposed to hold collapsed in days. Fritz's unit was cut off, surrounded, fragmented. Communication with higher command ceased. They were on their own. 11 men. A sergeant who wanted nothing more than to survive, and orders that no longer meant anything because there was no one left to give them. Fritz gathered his squad in a bombed-out farmhouse. "The war is over," he said quietly. "Maybe not officially, but for us, it's over. We can fight until we're killed. We can scatter and try to get home individually, or we can surrender to the next Allied unit we encounter." "Surrender to the Americans or British?" Gunther asked. Fritz thought about that. About Garrett Sullivan and his Texas ranch. About Alistair Byrne and the cellar at Arnhem. About 4 years of accumulated understanding. "British," he said finally. "Why?" "Because I saved one of their soldiers once. And I think they'll remember that. And because I want to survive this war with my honor intact. I want to go home to my wife, knowing I did the right thing at the end." It was a thin hope, but hope was all he had left. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to get him home to Anna. April 12th, 1945. They found a British patrol, or rather, the British patrol found them. Fritz's squad was moving through a forest, trying to stay ahead of the advancing front lines. They walked around a bend in the trail and there they were. 12 British soldiers, weapons ready,
just as surprised as the Germans. For a long moment, nobody moved. Fritz looked at the British officer. Young, maybe 29, captain's insignia, the kind of face that said, "I've seen combat and survived it and learned from it." The captain looked back at Fritz, assessing, calculating. Fritz made a decision. He lowered his rifle, raised his hands. "We surrender," he said in English. Behind him, his squad hesitated for only a moment before following his lead. The British captain approached cautiously. "You speak English?" "Yes, I am Sergeant Friedrich Schneider. These are my men. We wish to surrender."
"You're a long way from your lines, Sergeant."
"There are no lines anymore. The war is over." The captain studied Fritz. Something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or just exhaustion that mirrored Fritz's own. "I'm Captain Nathaniel Hartley. You and your men are now prisoners of war. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Do you understand?" "Yes, thank you." Nathaniel gestured to his men. They moved forward to search the Germans, confiscate weapons. Professional, not brutal, not kind either, just doing their job. One of Nathaniel's soldiers paused while searching Fritz. "Sir, he's got letters here, and a diary." "Let me see." Fritz watched as Nathaniel examined the diary. It was the one Fritz had taken from Lieutenant Parrish at Arnhem. He had kept it all these months, not sure why. A talisman, maybe, a reminder that the enemy was human. Nathaniel's eyes widened. "This is British. Where did you get this?" "Arnhem, after the battle.
"I found it in the ruins."
"Arnhem?" Nathaniel's voice changed. "You fought at Arnhem?" "Yes. Northern Bridge approaches. 9 days." Nathaniel looked at Fritz differently now, soldier to soldier, veteran to veteran. "That was hell," Nathaniel said quietly, "for both sides." "You were there when—" Nathaniel paused. "We lost a lot of good men." "So did we." Nathaniel handed the diary back. "Keep it. When this is over, maybe it should go to Parrish's family, if he had one." He did. I read his letters. A moment of understanding passed between them. Two men who had fought on different sides of the same nightmare, who had watched friends die for objectives that, in the end, meant nothing except that someone had ordered them to be important. "There's something else," Nathaniel said. "Do you know a Corporal Alistair Byrne?" Fritz's heart stopped. "Yes. I encountered him at Arnhem. He was wounded. I helped him." "Helped him?" "I bandaged his wounds, hid him from the SS.
"He reminded me of a friend I had lost, and I have a wife. I wanted to be the kind of man she could be proud of."
Nathaniel smiled. Actually smiled. "Alistair told us that story. Said a German sergeant saved his life. Didn't believe it at first. Thought he was delirious from the wound." "He survived?" "He did. Evacuated with the rest of 1st Airborne. He's back in England now, recuperating." Nathaniel extended his hand. "Thank you for that. For showing mercy when you didn't have to." Fritz shook his hand. Enemy to enemy, soldier to soldier, human to human. "We're all just trying to go home," Fritz said. "To the people we love." "Yes, we are." The POW camp was near Brussels. Not bad as far as prisoner facilities went. Food was adequate, shelter was dry. The British guards were firm but not cruel. Fritz spent his days waiting for the war to end and wondering if Anna had survived. He spent his evenings talking with British soldiers who guarded the camp. Young men,
Tired men. Men who wanted this war to be over as much as the prisoners did.
One evening, Captain Nathaniel Hartley visited the camp. Found Fritz sitting alone, writing another letter to Anna that might never be delivered. "May I join you?" Fritz gestured to the bench beside him. They sat in silence for a while. Around them, the camp settled into evening routine. Men heading to barracks, guards changing shifts, the ordinary rhythm of military life, even in captivity. "I've been thinking about Arnhem," Nathaniel said finally. "So have I, for 6 months. What was it like? From your side?" Fritz considered how to answer, how to explain 9 days of hell to someone who had been on the other side of it. Terrifying, he said simply. We had numbers, we had armor, we had artillery, and we couldn't dislodge a few hundred paratroopers. Every time we thought you were finished, you kept fighting. Every time we thought we had won, you proved us wrong. We were just following orders. Hold the bridge. Simple orders. Simple to say, impossible to execute. But you did it anyway. Fritz looked at Nathaniel. That's what I could never understand. You fought past the point where fighting made sense. You held positions that should have been abandoned. You refused to acknowledge that you were beaten, even when you clearly were beaten. Is that what made you afraid of us? Yes, because I didn't know how to fight that. How to fight men who wouldn't accept reality. Nathaniel smiled sadly. We weren't refusing to accept reality. We were creating a new one. Orders said, hold the bridge. So reality became, we hold the bridge or we die trying. Everything else was irrelevant. That's insane. Maybe, but it's what made us dangerous. Fritz thought about that. About Klaus dying at Pegasus Bridge. About Alistair in the cellar. About 9 days at Arnhem. You weren't ghosts, Fritz said quietly. I thought you were. For years I thought you were something supernatural. Something beyond human. But you weren't. You were just men who refused to fail. Is there a difference? Yes, because understanding that you're human makes you less terrifying. Still dangerous. Still worthy of respect, but not monsters. Nathaniel pulled out a photo, his wife and a baby daughter, born while he was overseas. She's 6 months old. I've never met her. I've been fighting since before she was born. Fritz pulled out his photo of Anna, worn now, creased from being carried through 4 years of war. Their wedding photo, 3 days in Italy, a lifetime ago. My wife, we married in August 1944. Had 3 days together before I was sent north to Arnhem. I don't know if she's alive. They looked at each other's photos. 2 soldiers, different uniforms, same hopes, same fears, same desperate desire to survive and go home to the people they loved. We're not so different, Nathaniel said. No, we're not. We just wore different colors. And we both did terrible things because men in offices told us to. Fritz nodded. The British paratroopers I fought, the American soldiers I encountered, the German boys I tried to keep alive. We were all just following orders, trying to survive, trying to get home. Do you hate us? For winning? Fritz considered that. Did he hate them? No, I'm grateful. Because if you hadn't won, the war would have continued. More boys like Peter would have died. More bridges would have been fought over. More letters would have been written that never got delivered. He looked at Nathaniel. You won. We lost. But we all survived. And that's what matters now. May 8th, 1945. The war ended. In the POW camp, German prisoners heard the news with mixed emotions. Relief that it was over. Grief for all they had lost. Uncertainty about what came next. Fritz sat alone and thought about Klaus, about Helmut, about Werner and Peter and all the others. They hadn't survived to see this day, but Fritz had, and he owed it to their memory to make something of that survival. A week later, a letter arrived, forwarded through military postal channels, delayed by months, barely legible. Anna's handwriting. Fritz's hands shook as he opened it. My dearest Fritz, I am alive. I am in Bavaria, working at a hospital for wounded soldiers. I received 3 of your letters all at once. I cried reading them. I thought you were dead. Thank God you survived. The war is ending. Soon we will be together again. I love you more than words can say. Wait for me. Your wife, Anna. Fritz read it 5 times. Then he cried. Not from sadness, from relief so profound it felt like drowning. She was alive. He was alive. They had both survived. Everything else, the fear, the fighting, the 4 years of hell, it was over. Madison, Wisconsin, October 1985, late evening. Fritz opened the wooden box. Inside, letters,
photos, documents, the accumulated evidence of 40 years.
He pulled out a thick envelope. British postmark, recent.
This is from Alistair Byrne. He writes me every few months, has for 40 years. Elias leaned forward. What does he write about? Life, family, memories. Sometimes we talk about Arnhem. Sometimes we just talk about our grandchildren. Fritz smiled. He says he owes me his life. I tell him I was just doing what any decent man would do. We argue about it like old friends. Fritz pulled out another envelope. American postmark, much older. This came in 1979, from Texas, from Garrett Sullivan's son. The American you captured? Yes. Garrett survived the war, went home to Fort Worth, took over his father's ranch, raised a family. He died in 1978. Fritz's voice grew soft. His son wrote to tell me, said Garrett had talked about me, about the German sergeant who treated his wounds and told him we were all just trying to go home. Said it changed how Garrett saw the war, saw enemies. Did you write back? Yes.
We corresponded for a few years. He sent me photos of the ranch, of Garrett's family, proof that the young man I captured went on to live a good life. Fritz pulled out the last item, Lieutenant Parrish's diary. And this, I still have this. I wrote to the British War Office after the war, asked if Parrish had survived. He hadn't. Killed on day 7 at Arnhem. But he had a sister. She wrote me a letter thanking me for preserving his words, for caring enough to ask. Elias looked at the collection. You stayed connected to all of them, your enemies. They stopped being my enemies the moment the war ended. They became what they always were, men who fought because they were ordered to, men who wanted to go home, men who loved their families and feared death and did their best to survive. But you were afraid of the British. You said they terrified you. They did, because I didn't understand them. I thought they were monsters, ghosts, something inhuman. Fritz closed the box gently. But they were just stubborn, unbelievably, impossibly stubborn. They had been given impossible orders and they refused to fail. That made them dangerous, but it also made them human, more human than I wanted to admit. What about the Americans? The Americans were brave, honorable. They fought with courage and determination. They deserved every bit of respect we gave them. Fritz paused. But the British taught me something the Americans didn't. What? That fear can be a teacher. That respecting your enemy makes you a better soldier. That understanding the men trying to kill you makes you more human, not less. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Do you think I should join the army? Should I become a paratrooper? Fritz looked at his grandson. 16 years old, full of life, full of potential. That's not for me to decide. But I'll tell you what I told myself when I was your age. If you're going to fight, fight with honor. If you're going to kill, remember that you're killing someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. If you're going to survive, make that survival mean something. How do I do that? By being more than just a survivor, by being someone who learned from the war instead of being destroyed by it. Fritz put his hand on Elias's shoulder. I fought the British. I feared them. But they taught me the most important lesson of my life. What lesson? That your enemy is just a person in a different uniform, that courage comes in many forms, that stubbornness can be a virtue, and that when the shooting stops, we all want the same thing, to go home and be with the people we love. 1 week later, Fritz stood in his bakery, hands deep in dough, when the bell above the door chimed. An older man entered, British accent, 70s, walking with a slight limp. Fritz looked up, froze. Alistair? Hello, Fritz. They stared at each other across 40 years and an ocean of memory. Then Fritz came around the counter and embraced the man he had saved in a cellar in Arnhem. You didn't tell me you were coming to America? Wanted to surprise you, and I wanted to meet your family, see this life you built. They sat in the bakery, drinking coffee, talking like the old friends they had become through decades of letters. Do you still think about it? Alistair asked. Arnhem? Every day. You? Every day. Alistair smiled.
I tell my grandchildren about it sometimes, about 9 days of hell, about a German sergeant who saved my life when he should have killed me. I tell my grandson about British paratroopers who wouldn't surrender, who held a bridge against impossible odds, who taught me what real courage looked like. Were we brave or were we stupid? Fritz laughed. Both, definitely both. They talked for hours, about the war, about the years after, about the families they had raised and the lives they had built from the ashes of Europe. As evening approached, Alistair prepared to leave. "Thank you," he said at the door, "for saving me, for writing, for being my friend all these years." "Thank you," Fritz replied, "for teaching me that enemies can become brothers, that fear can become respect, that the ghosts were just men after all." They shook hands, then embraced again. When Alistair was gone, Fritz stood in his bakery and thought about journeys, about the distance from a battlefield in Holland to a bakery in Wisconsin, about the transformation from enemy to friend, about the long road from fear to understanding. Elias came in that evening, found his grandfather at the window, watching the sunset. "I've decided," Elias said. "And?" "I'm going to serve, but I'm going to remember everything you told me, about humanity, about respect, about seeing the person behind the uniform." Fritz nodded. "Then you'll be fine. You'll be better than fine. You'll be the kind of soldier the world needs." Anna appeared in the doorway, apron dusted with flour. Even at 63, she still had the same smile that had kept Fritz alive through 4 years of hell. "Dinner's ready," she said. Then, seeing their faces, "He told you everything?" Elias nodded, unable to speak. Anna walked to Fritz, put her hand on his shoulder. "Your grandfather is the bravest man I know. Not because he fought, because he chose to live with honor after the fighting stopped." Fritz covered her hand with his. 41 years of marriage, built on 3 days in Italy and a promise made in the middle of war. "We survived together," Fritz said quietly. "That's all that matters." Anna kissed his forehead. "And now we live together. That's everything." They stood together in the fading light. Outside, the American evening settled over Madison, Wisconsin. Inside, an old German soldier, his wife, and his grandson shared a moment of understanding that had been earned through blood and fear and 40 years of reflection. "The ghosts I feared," Fritz said quietly, "turned out to be the best teachers I ever had. They taught me courage. They taught me stubbornness. They taught me that refusing to fail can be its own kind of victory." "And they taught you to survive," Elias said. "No," Fritz shook his head. "They taught me something better than survival. They taught me how to live with myself after surviving. How to take the fear and the loss and the memory and turn it into wisdom. How to honor the dead by living well." He thought of Klaus and Helmut, of Garrett and his Texas ranch, of Alistair and their 40 years of friendship, of all the ghosts who had shaped him. "That's the real victory," Fritz said. "Not surviving the war, but surviving yourself after the war. Learning to be human again. Learning to see your enemies as the people they always were." Elias nodded, understanding settling over him like a mantle. "I won't let you down, Grandpa." "You won't, because you already understand what took me 4 years of war to learn." Fritz smiled. "That we're all just trying to go home. All of us. On every side of every conflict. And that understanding, that simple, profound understanding, makes all the difference." They stood together as the sun set on Madison, Wisconsin. An old soldier, his wife, and his grandson. An American future built on European memories. A story of ghosts who became men, enemies who became friends, and fear that became the deepest kind of respect. And in that sunset moment, Fritz felt something he hadn't felt in 40 years. Peace. Not the absence of war, but the presence of understanding. The ghosts had finally stopped haunting him, because he understood now what they had always been. Not monsters, not demons, just men doing impossible things because someone had ordered them to. And in that understanding, Fritz had found something worth surviving for, something worth passing on, something worth remembering. The war had ended 40 years ago, but the lessons, the hard, bloody, necessary lessons, those were eternal, and they were worth every painful step of the journey, every fear conquered, every ghost understood, every enemy made human. Fritz looked at his grandson and smiled. Anna squeezed his shoulder. The story was finished, but the wisdom would live on, and that, in the end, was victory enough.